Welcome to podcast 42. And the last podcast, we looked at what Hardy and Weinberg told us about what a population would look like if it did not evolve. What kinds of parameters would have to be in place for a non-evolving population. The parameters that have to be in place in order for a population to not undergo evolutionary change are these 5 factors. It has to be extremely large. Infinite would be nice. There can be no gene flow in or out. No individuals can enter or leave. No sex cells can enter or leave. There can be no mutations. DNA must stay the same from generation to generation. No random mating. All mating must be completely at random. Nobody gets to pick who they think is cute. No natural selection, certainly. Everybody is equally fit in the environment. These must be in place for a non-evolving population. And they showed us mathematically that if a population is not evolving, if a population is only being affected by sex and meiosis, and none of these factors is involved, then the population, mathematically, the frequency of the different alleles and genotypes in the population would stay the same. So naturally, it begs the question, so what happens if one of these 5 different parameters is not met? In other words, what happens if we have some gene flow? What happens if we have some mutations? Well, then we have evolution. Notice, however, that natural selection is only one of 5 different ways that we can get evolutionary change. What this means is not all changes in organisms are due to natural selection. I should say not all changes in populations and species are due to natural selection. Some of them are due to other factors, 4 other factors, okay? Natural selection is only one, and it's the only one that results in organisms that are actually becoming more fit in their environment. All of these other ones may not necessarily have to do anything with fitness for survivability in the environment. So, what we're going to look at then are what happens when each of these parameters is not met, how that looks. So, let me get out of, go to slide. Okay. So then, things that can cause evolutionary change. Mutations. If you change the DNA, you might introduce a new trait. You might get some evolutionary change because of that. Gene flow, genes moving in and out of a population, whether it's by pollen being blown in or carried into a population from a different population, or whether it's animals physically moving in or out of a population, and so on. Non-random mating, where we actually choose the partner we think is cute or feathered in just the perfect way or whatever. We don't pick at random. Genetic drift, we'll talk about what that means in a bit, and of course natural selection. These are 5 things that can cause evolutionary change. Of these 5, only this one is adaptive change to the environment. Okay? All right. Mutation creates different offspring. It creates, different genes. A gene could be a particular way for reasons we may or may not understand. UV light can alter nucleotide, and boom, we've got a different amino acid and then a different protein and a different trait. Mutation creates variation in offspring. New mutations appear because of mutagens, because of genetic accidents, and we get new traits. Okay, so obviously mutation can lead to variation, which then can lead to natural selection and all kinds of things. Gene flow is the movement of individuals or their gametes, and maybe I need to make sure we understand, or the individual's gametes, particularly think of pollen, into a population or out of a population. So I have my population of deer. Some of those deer decide to leave. They take their genes with them, and that changes the gene pool here and what's going to be left behind. So seeds and pollen, migration of animals, and so on. Okay. Interestingly, the more gene flow you have between two different populations, if I've got a population down here, and these are deer as well, and if they start sending critters back and forth, these two populations are going to get more similar because they will be exchanging genes back and forth between them, and so the populations increasingly become genetically similar. It is only when a population of organisms is separated and these organisms go their separate ways that we would get increasing difference between organisms. Human evolution is a great example. The many different races and so on that we have, as travel and whatnot allows us to come together and marry, and our traits become blended, and we will eventually become increasingly similar as opposed to different as our genes are shared among our different population groups. Okay? Non-random mating. Non-random mating, again, is mating that you got to pick your mate as opposed to just grabbing the first body that you came to. Okay? There are two major types. The first type is inbreeding. Basically, this is mating with whoever is closest to you, as opposed to folks in your population who might be further away. So here I am right here, and here's everyone in my population, but I'm going to tend to mate with those that are nearest me. And guess who those that are nearest me usually are? They're usually my relatives. Okay? So it does increase the likelihood of mating with a close relative, and of course the most extreme form of non-random mating is to mate with yourself. Self-fertilization. The effect of inbreeding generally is to increase the homozygotes in your population and decrease the heterozygotes. And that makes sense if you think about it. If you are homozygote, you're right here and you're homozygote, and you're going to mate with your cousin homozygote over here, you both are homozygous and your offspring will all be just like you. Okay? Just like that. But suppose the two of you are actually heterozygous. What's going to happen then is you're not going to replace, every time you mate, you're not just going to create an identical copy of you. Some of your offspring will be this, some of your offspring will be that. And in fact, over time, as inbreeding occurs, you are going to reduce the number of yourselves, your big A, little a, and increase the homozygous population, because you don't just always create more of yourselves. So inbreeding decreases heterozygotes, increases homozygotes, which is why it's commonly thought that inbreeding in humans, for example, or dogs might lead to disease, because the likelihood that you are going to get this bad recessive allele increases if you are inbreeding within your own population. Okay. Another type, and perhaps a much more important type, I'm going to star this one because it is important, of non-random mating, is sexual selection. This is when usually a female is selecting something she sees in the male that she really likes. And you need to think of these, what are called secondary sexual characteristics, not reproductive organs, but the differences in males and females that we, for example, the lion's mane is a secondary sexual characteristic. In humans, facial hair is a secondary sexual characteristic. Peacock feathers. And it is thought, generally speaking, though certainly not always, that the females select for some of these bizarre, exaggerated traits because they indicate, whether she is aware of this is likely not, but these things, these attention grabbing devices, indicate vigor and health and good genes, and if a peacock can make that big display of feathers, then wow, he must be really healthy and have a lot of good DNA, and so the female's attention is grabbed and she mates with him, and that trait is perpetuated in the offspring. Intersexual selection between the sexes, the females choose who they like best, I think that's all we need to say about that. Okay, genetic drift. This is really important. This has everything to do with the size of the population. Remember, Hardy and Weinberg said that in order for no evolution to occur, the population had to be big, had to be large. Infinitely large would be nice. Well, we know that doesn't happen. And the fact that is that the smaller the population is, the bigger the effect of random events on that population. Okay? It's just like your coin toss. If you toss a coin only 10 times, it is quite possible you could get 7 heads and 3 tails. But if you toss it 1,000 times, then you're probably going to get closer to a 50-50 or 500 to 500 ratio. Well, if you have a small population, the chance that it is going to have genes that are representative of the entire gene pool for the species are not high. It's probably going to have just some genes that the rest of the gene pool doesn't have in that much, just because of random chance. So genetic drift. Let me give you an example. Suppose I've got a population of deer. So here they are. You're just going to have to be patient while I draw my deer, and they are I'm a very talented artist, so this may take me a few minutes. I have a lot of attention to detail that goes into these drawings. So here's my deer population. Okay, now these are all pretty normal looking deer, and then there's this one deer. Okay, and this is poor Howard the deer, and Howard has got issues, as you can see. Okay, and Howard doesn't get many dates. The girls would much rather mate with, Brad or Bentley or whoever's over here. They're not really interested in this guy. Okay, he never seems to get the girl. But one day the tornado comes through and bunches of deer just died, and all that was left was this poor little female deer and Howard, or whatever I said his name was. All of a sudden, Howard's genes are going to get represented in this population, and a lot more than they would have if we hadn't lost all of these guys. Okay? The offspring are going to show Howard's traits. Are they the most adaptive traits for their environment? Probably not. Natural selection had nothing to do with this, but the outcome for the population is going to be dramatically affected. And this is what natural selection ultimately will act on. It'll work with what it's got. And so we're going to see their offspring having these traits. Represented much more than if Howard had been one of many deer. Okay, so that is the effect of genetic drift. I'm going to skip over this. Okay, there are a couple of ways to think about genetic drift. occurring. One of them is for it to occur by way of founder effect. And what that implies, that some small group of organisms in a population, so here's a population of birds, and these birds, even though some are yellow and some are red, they can interbreed. They're in the same species. But some group, maybe because of a storm, a small group of the red gets blown off course and sent over to this island. So this is the group that will breed and populate this island. They're not genetically representative of the entire population over here, because there's some yellow birds over here that aren't over here, and those genes will not get represented. So this population is going to take a different evolutionary path perhaps than what this population would take, simply because some genes were not included in the new colony. The founders of this colony were just the red birds. So that's an example of founder effect. Another example of something that can cause genetic drift is when a population passes through a bottleneck. This would be kind of like the situation with these deer back here. Sorry, I didn't realize how. This population passed through a bottleneck. A huge number of deer were culled out of the population. So if we think of a bottleneck, you've got a bunch of organisms in the bottle, but only a few get to pass through. Howard passed through the bottleneck, and this poor unfortunate female deer, and they're going to repopulate. But boy, is that population going to look different, because Howard's genes are going to be much more represented than they would have been otherwise. A great example of a bottleneck is the cheetah, for example. In the situation with the cheetah, there were a couple of different bottlenecks that the cheetah population passed through. The first was the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago. Many cheetahs died off during that time, but they have passed through a second bottleneck since then due to human factors affecting their population. And now there is very little diversity in this population. It's so small that it's as if all cheetahs were in fact identical twins, or just about. So very little variation. Here's another great example of a bottleneck. Elephant seals in California, the northern elephant seals, were actually hunted down to the point where there were only 20 of these animals left. Because of protections placed on them, the population rebounded to over 30,000, but they are genetically identical in at least 24 places on their genome, and probably more. There is very little variety left in this population. These few individuals repopulated all of this, and they are almost genetically identical. Okay? Were these 20 representative of all of the elephant seals that existed before the bottleneck? Probably not. So we don't have as much variety. This plays a huge role in conservation biology when we're trying to bring species back from being near the brink of extinction, because you do lose your variety, and that means these animals are very susceptible to disease, because if one animal is susceptible to the disease, all of them are, because they're all genetically identical. So variety is healthy, and when you've passed through a bottleneck, sometimes you don't have a whole lot of it. Okay, let me give you a concrete example of founder effect. There is a small island in the very southern Atlantic, you can see it down here, called Tristan da Cunha, and it was colonized by a very small group of people, I believe Europeans, but honestly I'm not sure. I have to look it up. One of the colonists, however, that originally founded this colony had a fairly rare allele for a type of blindness, and that allele is not common in the general population that the colonists came from, but it is very common on Tristan da Cunha because of this founding colonist was where the offspring came from for this island, and so that gene for blindness is much higher, more frequent on this island than it is in the general population of the parent group for these colonists. Now, is that because the blindness is a good thing to have? Of course not. It is just the bad luck that this blind guy was one of the ones that came over and colonized this island, and his genes got overrepresented in the population that followed. All right. The fifth means of evolutionary change, of course, is natural selection, and this is the only one that leads to actual adaptation. The others do not necessarily lead to adaptation. This is the only one that does. Okay, so all kinds of things can press a population towards becoming more fit to a particular environment. Okay, only cause that is adaptive. All right, so there's your 5 causes of evolutionary change. All of these can cause changes in allele and genotype frequencies in a population. Only this one causes a species to become better adapted to its environment. The rest of these may, but may not. Okay, one question that people who have misgivings about the ideas of evolution and natural selection raise is, if evolution by natural selection is making you better adapted to your environment, then why aren't all organisms identically perfect on the planet? Why doesn't natural selection just get rid of all the bad genes? And there's lots and lots of reasons why, but one of them that we'll talk about first is there are actually mechanisms that preserve variation within our genomes of all species. One of these is diploidy. Diploidy actually can preserve variation and inhibit natural selection from getting rid of bad alleles, because if you're diploid, you can hide some of those bad alleles in the heterozygote condition. If that is a lethal allele, this organism has the allele, but it's not going to die because this big A hides it. So, diploid, having 2 sets of chromosomes, diploidy means you have 2 sets of genes, 2 sets, one from mom, one from dad, 2 sets of genes. You get a big A from mom, a little a from dad. Mom's big A is going to hide dad's little a. So that little a in the heterozygote can never get selected against because it's being hidden. Natural selection can't act on what it doesn't see. Natural selection could only act on that individual that actually has the recessive bad disorder, for example. Okay. Now, there are even instances where natural selection will act to increase the number of heterozygotes, increase the number of lethal alleles that are hidden because of something called heterozygote advantage. You should know about this. They love to ask about it, and you should associate it with sickle cell anemia, the classic example. In sickle cell anemia, which is a bad thing, the completely recessive individual has lots of blood cells that are shaped like that. They are misshapen, they don't flow properly through the capillaries, causes all kinds of horrible effects. Okay? However, the individual that is this doesn't have sickle cell anemia, but they do have enough funky blood cells that it makes their blood resistant to, do you remember? Have you heard this? Resistant to malaria. Okay? So you don't have the disease, but you are resistant to malaria. And if you live in Africa, that's a good thing because malaria is a problem there. So this individual is good to go in that they don't have sickle cell anemia, this double dominant individual, but they're not as good as this person because this person doesn't have sickle cell anemia either, but they are also resistant to malaria. So obviously in Africa, this poor person's going to die. This person will live, but this person is going to stand an even better chance of living because they are resistant to that nasty malarial parasite. Okay? All right. This map is just showing you places where sickle cell is common. The allele is most common, and it's also showing you where malaria is common, and you can see there's quite a bit of overlap in where you find sickle cell allele and where you find malaria. All right, one other mechanism that actually preserves variation is having variation that doesn't make any difference to your survivability, neutral variation. If differences between organisms don't matter, I don't know, hair color in humans, for example, let's say that doesn't matter, then there's no selection pressure against it or for it. So you just keep having all this variation because there's no selection pressure to get rid of it or to encourage it. It just hangs around. Now, maybe someday that variation matters and natural selection could act on it, but there's all kinds of neutral variation, and natural selection can't act for or against that. All right, now, why else can't natural selection craft perfect, and I put that in quotes, organisms? A, because there's lots of mechanisms that actually favor variation and in living things, the diploidy and heterozygote advantage and all that. But also, organisms are just locked into historical constraints. Natural selection is not magic. It can't work with what's not there. It works with what is there. You can't scrap your ancestors' anatomy and just start with the perfect fit. Humans have notorious problems with their backs, and that's because we are built from an organism that originally started on 4 legs. It wasn't the ideal skeleton to start with for an upright bipedal creature, but it's what natural selection had to work with, and so it's not perfect because our ancestral anatomy, natural selection worked with what it had. Okay, adaptations are often compromises. A seal lives in water and on land. It is a fantastic swimmer. It's pretty clumsy on land. It's a compromise. It can move on land. It can do a lot of things on land, but it's not as great a land animal as it is a swimming animal. There is no perfect fit for that, most likely. It's a compromise. Okay? Not all evolution is in fact adaptive, as we've seen. Genetic drift, it's just bad luck sometimes, or good luck sometimes. Whatever genes the population gets started with because of passing through a bottleneck or a founder effect or whatever. Sometimes it's just luck that drives evolutionary change and not selection. Okay? Selection can only edit variations that exist. This kind of goes back to the human back thing. Natural selection works with the phenotypes that are available, and those may not have ideal traits for the way selection is pressing the organism, but it works with what it's got. Okay? New alleles do not arise on demand. It's not magic. Okay? Something to remember, natural selection definitely operates on a better than basis. Does this fit this environment better than what's present? If so, then that's going to get to survive, and whatever doesn't have the trait isn't going to get to survive. It's better than. It's not, is this perfect? So there will be subtle imperfections. We're just working with the best we've got. Natural selection can act as an agent of change. If the environment is changing, the organisms can be pressed to change along with it over time, but it also can be an agent to maintain things as they are. If the environment is stable, organisms that differ from organisms that are surviving well in the environment will probably get selected against. There's no reason to change. evolution, we usually see lots of evolutionary change when a population is stressed, when the environment is changing. That's when we see organisms experiencing evolutionary change. It's not trivial to remember that a population either adjusts or it becomes extinct, and the fossil record does tell us that there's a lot of extinction that has occurred, and it is in fact eventually the most common outcome for species. Those populations that survive a environmental crisis often change enough over thousands of years that in fact, if we saw them, we would say that's a new species, and that is often how new species arise. Okay, we're going to stop there. I'm going to talk with you very quickly about different modes of selection, and you'll understand what that means. But thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next podcast.